The night air hung heavy, thick with the scent of oil and rust, mingling with the lingering heat of the day. The neon sign from Cooper's Auto Repair flickered weakly, casting red and blue reflections onto the cracked pavement. The town had settled into its usual quiet, the only sounds coming from the occasional buzz of a street lamp and the distant hum of a truck passing on the highway. Then came the growl. A deep, rolling rumble, like thunder creeping in from the horizon. I wiped my hands on a grease-stained rag, my sharp gaze lifting toward the empty stretch of road leading into town. The sound grew louder, closer, vibrating in my chest before I even saw them. Headlights pierced the darkness. One by one, they emerged from the shadows, moving in formation like a pack of predators. 7 motorcycles. Their chrome fangs glinted under the dim streetlights, each bike unique, customized, battle-worn, yet unified in menace. My pulse stayed steady. Slow. I'd seen men like this before. Not here, not in this quiet town, but in another life. A life where danger didn't announce itself with roaring engines and leather jackets. Back then, the threats were quieter. Deadlier. The bikes rolled to a stop, their riders forming a staggered line across the street. The engines rumbled like caged animals, waiting to be unleashed. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, they dismounted. They weren't just men, they were monuments to brutality. Towering figures wrapped in cracked leather and worn denim, their arms inked with stories of violence, their faces carved from years of survival. They moved with the kind of confidence that came from knowing no one dared challenge them. I exhaled slowly. I knew who they were. The Black Vultures. A name whispered in hushed tones across truck stops and dive bars. A name tied to broken bones and buried regrets. They weren't the biggest gang out there, not by a long shot, but they had a reputation. A reputation for taking what they wanted, and leaving ruin in their wake. The leader stepped forward. Salt and pepper beard. Cold, watchful eyes. A heavy silver chain hanging around his neck, catching the dull glow of the street lamp. He stopped a few feet away, tilting his head slightly, a smirk tugging at his scarred lip. Evening, mechanic. His voice was slow, measured, as if savoring each word. I didn't respond. Another man stepped up beside him, younger but just as dangerous. He twirled a keychain around his finger, the metallic glint catching the light. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he tossed something to the ground. A woman's leather jacket. It crumpled at my feet. I didn't move. The leader's smirk widened. Recognize it? I did. The faint scent of her perfume still clung to the fabric, subtle but unmistakable. My jaw tightened. You know, the leader continued, stepping closer, your wife's got good taste. Real open mind, too. The others chuckled, low and knowing. We showed her a real good time. My fingers twitched. The night around us seemed to still, the world shrinking down to the space between me and the man in front of me. The air was thick with gasoline and tension. The silence hummed with unspoken violence. I finally spoke, my voice quiet. Come. Deadly. You should leave. The leader blinked, feigning surprise. That's so. He glanced over his shoulder at the 6 men behind him, all of them smirking, waiting. You hear that, boys? He wants us to leave. Laughter rippled through them. A pack of wolves circling their prey. I let the moment stretch. Let them enjoy it. Let them believe, for just a few more seconds, that they were in control. Then I took a single step forward. One step. A shift of weight. A breath of movement. And everything changed. The laughter faded. The leader's smirk faltered, just slightly. And in that flicker of hesitation, I saw it. The instinct buried beneath his arrogance. A whisper at the back of his mind. Danger. Without breaking eye contact, I reached up and slid off my jacket. It hit the ground in a heap. The leader's gaze flicked to my arms, lean, corded muscle. Scars tracing faded stories across my skin. Scars that only men who had walked through hell could recognize. The smirk vanished. I rolled my shoulders once, loosening them. Then I exhaled. And the storm began. The night air grew heavier, thick with the scent of gasoline and sweat. The neon lights from the auto shop flickered, their weak glow casting fractured shadows across the pavement. The 7 bikers stood in a loose semicircle, their heavy boots scraping against the ground, leather jackets creaking with every slow movement. I exhaled, steady and controlled. Fear wasn't something I entertained. Fear was for men who had something to lose. And tonight, I had nothing. The only thing left was making sure these men understood the gravity of their mistake. With deliberate calm, I reached up, unfastened my coat, and let it slip from my shoulders. The fabric barely made a sound as it hit the pavement. Silence. A ripple of unease passed through the group. One of them stepped forward first, an enormous man with a thick, unkempt beard, arms the size of tree trunks. His nickname didn't matter, but judging by the way the others watched him, he was their heavy hitter. He cracked his knuckles, lips curling into a smug grin. "You sure about this, mechanic?" he sneered. 7 against 1, it's gonna be a short night for you." I didn't answer, just tilted my head slightly. A quiet challenge. He took the bait. The massive biker lunged, his right fist cocked back in a clumsy, overconfident swing. I stepped aside at the last second. Effortless. His blow cut through nothing but air. Before he could react, I pivoted and drove my elbow hard into the side of his skull. A sharp, sickening impact. His head snapped sideways, his body following an instant later as he crumpled to the ground like a felled tree. The first one down. For the first time that night, the laughter stopped. I scanned the rest of them, my stance easy, casual. A second man, shorter but built like a pit bull, let out a growl before charging. "You're dead," he spat, drawing back for a punch. I intercepted mid-motion, catching his wrist and twisting it violently. A sharp pop. A guttural scream. His arm bent at an unnatural angle. His knees buckled. He hit the pavement with a choked cry, cradling his ruined limb. The others hesitated now. The amusement in their eyes had faded, replaced by something I recognized well. Doubt. 3 seconds in. 2 down. 5 left. The next 2 moved together, a smarter approach. One aimed low, trying to tackle me, while the other swung a metal chain, aiming for my head. I made my choice in an instant. The one with the chain was the bigger threat. He swung wide, but I ducked under the arc, closing the distance before he could recover. My hand shot out, catching his wrist. A sharp wrench sideways. Then I drove my knee into his ribs. Hard. The chain slipped from his grip, clattering to the ground. The second biker, Diesel, judging by the name stitched onto his vest, slammed into my side, trying to bring me down. I let the momentum carry us both backward. At the last second, I twisted, using his weight against him. He went flying. Hit the pavement with a painful thud. Wheezing for breath. I straightened just in time to see the first guy scrambling for his fallen chain. Too slow. I stomped down on his hand. Hard. A scream tore from his throat. Then, without hesitation, I bent down, wrapped the chain around his throat, tight, but not enough to kill. Just enough to make a point. "Tap out," I murmured. His hands clawed at the metal links. Then he nodded frantically. I let go. 4 down. 3 left. The remaining trio hesitated, shifting their weight uncertainly. A minute ago, this fight had been theirs. Now the tide had turned. And they knew it. I rolled my shoulders, blood humming in my veins. Who's next? They didn't answer. Then, as if some unspoken agreement passed between them, they stepped back. One of them grabbed Diesel, pulling him to his feet. I let them go. For now. The night air was thick with tension, the neon lights flickering once more, casting my shadow long across the pavement. I stood still, breathing evenly, as the bikers vanished into the darkness. I knew this wasn't over. But I wasn't worried. When they came back, if they dared, I'd be waiting. Kevin Slater crouched on the asphalt, breathing hard. His gang, his brothers, once towering figures of arrogance, now lay sprawled across the pavement, groaning in pain or knocked out cold. The laughter. Gone. The mockery. Silenced. Only the dull hum of a flickering street lamp remained, crackling against the quiet of the night. A heavy fog of gasoline, blood, and sweat settled over the street. I didn't move. I didn't need to. I stood still, shoulders squared, breathing slow and steady. My fists were loose at my sides, but every muscle in my body was coiled, waiting. Ready. The last man standing, or rather, the last man kneeling, was Kevin. He wiped a trickle of blood from his mouth, his fingers trembling slightly. His pride had been stomped into the dirt right alongside his men, and now, the weight of humiliation pressed down on his chest like an iron slab. He was the leader. The strongest. The one no one dared challenge. Yet here he was. On his knees. A sharp breath hissed through his teeth. No. He wasn't going out like this. In a flash, his hand darted to his belt. A glint of steel. A hunting knife, smooth and wickedly sharp. He wasn't a fool. He'd seen what I could do with my bare hands. But fists meant nothing against cold, hard steel. His fingers tightened around the handle. I sighed. A slow, deliberate sound. Tilting my head slightly, I watched. Waiting. Then he lunged. The blade came in fast, low, aiming for my ribs, a kill shot. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I stepped forward. At the last second, my left hand snapped out, catching his wrist in a vice grip. Before he could react, I twisted. Pop. A strangled yell ripped from his throat. His grip faltered. The knife slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the pavement. But I wasn't done. Shifting my weight, I pivoted on one foot, wrenching his arm forward, using his own momentum against him. He stumbled, his body thrown off balance, his injured arm twisted painfully behind his back. Then I drove my knee up. Hard. Right into his gut. The air exploded from his lungs in a violent gasp. His legs buckled. He hit the ground with a heavy thud, his breath ragged, body shuddering from pain and shock. The man who had once terrorized bars, motels, and backstreets without consequence was now at my mercy. I crouched down beside him. I didn't need to say anything. The message was written all over his face. Fear. But I wasn't a man of half measures. I leaned in, my voice low. Steady. Cold. Tell your boys, I began, my grip tightening on his wrist, just enough to make the pain spike, but not enough to break it. Not yet. If I ever hear that you've hurt another woman in this town. I leaned in closer, just enough that he could feel the quiet threat in my words. If I ever see you or your crew near me again. I let the pause stretch, let the weight of what I was about to say settle into his bones. You won't be getting back up next time. Silence. Heavy. His jaw clenched. His pride warred with his survival instinct. He wanted to spit back, to snarl, to make some empty promise of revenge. But he didn't. Because deep down, beneath the anger, the humiliation, the pain, he knew the truth. I wasn't just some backwater mechanic. I wasn't a man to push. I was the kind of man you didn't cross twice. I let go of his wrist with a dismissive flick. Rising smoothly to my feet, I turned, walking toward my coat, still lying where I'd tossed it. Behind me, Kevin gasped for breath, clutching his arm. His men, those who could still move, watched from the sidelines, faces pale, confidence shattered. I shrugged on my coat, straightened the collar, and glanced back. Just once. Then I walked away. Not in a rush. Not in fear. Because I knew, none of them would dare follow. The neon light of the roadside motel flickered, humming softly like a dying electric current against the quiet of the night. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few rusted cars and a row of motorcycles lined up like hunting dogs at rest. Above the reception desk, a faded sign read Sunset Inn. The only thing setting tonight was whatever patience I had left. My boots crunched against the gravel as I made my way toward room 7. The door was slightly ajar. A warm glow spilled through the crack, casting long, uneasy shadows onto the pavement. I reached out, pushed it open without hesitation, and stepped inside. The scent hit me first, stale cigarettes and cheap perfume, clinging to the walls like a bad memory. And there she was. Madison sat on the bed, one leg lazily draped over the other, a cigarette dangling between her fingers. She didn't flinch at my presence. Didn't gasp. Didn't rush to cover herself. Instead, she exhaled a thin stream of smoke, tilting her head slightly as if I was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Well," she said, tapping ash into a half-empty beer bottle on the nightstand. "You actually showed up." I stood still, the door clicking shut behind me. My knuckles ached from earlier. My muscles were sore. The adrenaline had settled now, leaving behind a cold, quiet clarity. I didn't need to ask what had happened here. The crumpled sheets. The leather jacket draped carelessly over a chair. The faint scent of whiskey and sweat. It was all self-explanatory. "Did you enjoy the show?" she continued, her lips curling into something between a smirk and a sneer. "They said you'd come running." I didn't answer. My silence wasn't awkward. It wasn't searching for an escape. It stretched, pressing into every corner of the room like a looming storm. Madison rolled her eyes. "You're always so damn quiet. That's the problem, Ethan. You don't react. You don't fight for things. You just—" she waved a hand vaguely, cigarette smoke swirling in lazy circles. "Exist." I took a step forward. Not threatening. Not aggressive. Just enough to close the space between us. My voice, when I spoke, was calm. Too calm. "Was it worth it?" Her smirk faltered, just for a second. A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Uncertainty. Regret. Gone before it could settle. "You wouldn't understand," she muttered, looking away. "Try me." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "You think this is about them?" she scoffed, gesturing vaguely toward the door, toward the world outside. "It's not. It's about you. About what you've become." I remained still. Madison leaned forward, her voice dropping lower, laced with something sharp. "You used to be someone, Ethan. Before you came back to this dusty town. Before you buried yourself in that garage. You had fire. Purpose. Now." She shook her head, exhaling another slow drag of smoke. "Now you're just waiting to rust." My jaw clenched. She saw it, the slight twitch of the muscle beneath my skin. She smirked again, as if she'd landed some kind of victory. Madison leaned back against the headboard, ashing her cigarette onto the nightstand. "I needed to feel alive again," she said simply. "And I knew you weren't going to give me that." I exhaled. Slow. Measured. I'd seen war zones. I'd seen men at their most desperate, their most cruel. But this was different. It wasn't rage I felt. It wasn't even sadness. It was the slow, sinking realization that the woman in front of me, the woman I had once loved, was gone. Maybe she had been for a long time. I nodded once. A barely perceptible motion. Something inside me clicked into place. Madison watched me, waiting for a reaction. A yell. A threat. A plea. But I simply turned. Reached for the door. "That's it," she scoffed. "You're just going to walk away?" My hand rested on the cool metal of the doorknob. I looked over my shoulder, meeting her gaze one last time. "You made your choice, Madison," I said quietly. "Now you live with it." And with that, I stepped out into the night. The neon light buzzed overhead. The distant growl of a motorcycle rumbled down the road. I didn't look back. I never would. The town was awake long before the sun had fully risen. A buzz ran through the streets. Murmurs slithered through alleyways and diners, past gas stations and convenience stores. People whispered in hushed voices at breakfast counters. Truckers muttered over steaming cups of black coffee. Mechanics leaned against toolboxes, sharing the news in quiet, knowing tones. One man. 7 bikers. A massacre. At the heart of it all was one name. Ethan Cooper. The quiet mechanic. The man no one really noticed, until now. At first, nobody believed it. The black vultures were a menace. A force that prowled through town unchecked. They extorted. Terrorized. Took what they wanted. And now, they were gone. Some of them were still around, licking their wounds, nursing their injuries, but they didn't ride with the same arrogance anymore. They didn't rev their engines outside bars or leer at passing women. They barely left their hideout at the old scrapyard, waiting for the storm to pass. And Kevin Slater? Nowhere to be found. It didn't take long before the sheriff showed up at my shop. I was already working by the time he stepped through the door. Hands deep in the engine of an old Dodge Charger, the scent of gasoline thick in the air. I didn't look up when I heard the door creak open. Morning, Ethan. Sheriff. A long pause. He stepped further inside, kicking at a stray bolt on the floor. You mind telling me what happened last night? I wiped my hands on an oil-stained rag, my movements slow, deliberate. Nothing much, I said, finally meeting his gaze. Had a chat with some old friends. The sheriff exhaled through his nose. He wasn't a fool. He had seen the bruises, the swollen jaws, had walked past the black vultures that morning and watched them shrink back like wounded dogs. You could have called me, he muttered. I raised an eyebrow. Would you have stopped them? Silence. We both knew the answer. Another long pause stretched between us before the sheriff sighed, rubbing a hand over his graying beard. They won't come back, he said. Not after what you did. Good. That was all I said before turning back to my work. The sheriff watched me for a moment longer, then nodded to himself. You take care, Ethan. And with that, he walked out, leaving me alone with the steady hum of the engine. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Madison Cooper stood outside a cheap motel, staring at a small pile of luggage sitting on the pavement. Her luggage. A sinking feeling clawed its way up her throat. She stepped closer, as if somehow the sight would change. As if the bags weren't real. But they were. Her clothes. Her shoes. Her life. Packed up and dumped like garbage. The motel door was shut. I was gone. She swallowed hard, her nails biting into her palms. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to happen. I was supposed to break. I was supposed to beg. I was supposed to be the weak, pitiful man she could manipulate. The Ethan she had married, quiet, passive, predictable, should have crumbled the moment she betrayed him. Instead, I had done the unthinkable. Instead of crawling, I had fought. Instead of mourning her, I had erased her. Her stomach twisted with something bitter. Regret. No. Rage. She pulled out her phone, dialing my number with trembling fingers. Straight to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. For the first time in her life, Madison Cooper realized something chilling. She had never really known me at all. And now, she had lost everything. The air was heavy with the scent of motor oil and dust. The town, small and tired, sat in silence as the last light of day stretched across the horizon. The neon sign above Cooper's Auto Repair flickered weakly, humming with struggling electricity. I stood in the open garage doorway, hands in my pockets, staring at the world I had spent years building. A world that, in the span of one violent night, had unraveled. On the counter sat a battered leather duffel, half-zipped. A few shirts. A roll of cash. A worn-out service pistol I hadn't touched in years. I didn't need much. Everything I had ever needed had already been taken from me, burned to ash in the wake of betrayal and bloodshed. I exhaled slowly. I wasn't a man prone to reflection. But something about the silence made it feel like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I'd do next. I stepped outside. The cold steel of my 1969 Mustang Boss 429 gleamed under the dying light, its engine still warm from earlier. I had spent years restoring this machine. Every bolt tightened by my own hands. It was more than ACARIT was the last thing in my life that hadn't betrayed me. I placed the duffel on the passenger seat, fingers brushing against the cracked leather. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The town reflected back at me in distorted fragments. The rusted street signs. The abandoned diner where I used to take her on Sundays. The road leading to the motel where I had found her last night. A bitter smirk touched my lips. A sharp wind cut through the silence. I pulled the door shut. The heavy thunk echoed through the garage like the closing of a chapter. The sound of an ending. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, its deep growl cutting through the quiet. It was the only sound I needed to hear. No goodbyes. No explanations. Just the road. I shifted into gear, the tires crunching against the pavement as I rolled out onto Main Street. The town stretched before me like a forgotten memory. Faded. Quiet. Already slipping into the past. I passed the old gas station, its windows reflecting the fire-red sky. The place where I had once met her on late-night drives. Where we had laughed about leaving this place someday. She had always talked about escape. about bigger dreams. And in the end, she had left first. A block later, I saw movement. People watching. A group of men sat outside the bar, their conversation falling silent as they saw my car glide past. They didn't say a word. Didn't dare. The story of what had happened last night had already spread like wildfire. I didn't need to look at them to know what they were thinking. No one had ever gone against the black vultures and walked away. Until now. One of the men, younger, with a fresh scar along his jaw, gave me a slight nod. Respect. I didn't return it. This wasn't respect. It was fear. As I reached the edge of town, I slowed. The green road sign loomed ahead. Welcome to Stillwater. Population 4,236. A flickering street lamp hummed above it, casting long shadows across the dirt road. I let out a breath. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Then, without hesitation, I pressed the gas. The Mustang surged forward, kicking up dust and gravel as it roared onto the open highway. The town shrank in the rearview mirror. Its lights faded into nothing but distant specks. The road stretched wide and empty, bathed in the colors of the setting sun. Deep red. Burning gold. A sky painted in fire and blood. I never looked back. I never would. The past was dead. And the road ahead? It belonged only to me. Thank you for visiting my YouTube channel. Your support, likes, and comments truly inspire me to create even more engaging content. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. You're a part of this amazing community, and I'm thrilled to share my stories with you. See you in the next video on YouTube.